Can you channel or get in contact with an extraterrestrial right now?
Well, we're going to attempt to try to do that right now, Lou, and we're going to do it right here.
Let me make something clear at the start of this video. I love Louis Theroux. His documentaries provided me countless hours of entertainment growing up. His style of placing himself in weird situations that interrupt the monotonous flow of everyday life, exposing himself to radioactive levels of awkwardness, interacting with subcultures we're all typically too uncomfortable to get up close and personal with ourselves, has seen him become synonymous with that feeling of accidentally stumbling into a world in which you don't belong, but need to find some way to get through it.
I'm not really here, it's research. I'm Louis Theroux, I'm Louis Theroux.
His disarming, light-hearted dimension to his interactions allows the subject to lower their guard and express themselves more candidly, giving him the opportunity to impose himself and step into uncomfortable territory.
You feel your needs are being met.
My needs are being met in this relationship. But hypothetically, if Joe and Heidi said to me, hey, you want to join me? I would say sure.
For a three-way?
Absolutely, without a doubt.
What do you think about that, Heidi?
And I don't know that that's something that I would need.
As a child, I definitely had the sense that my reality was nerfed. You're insulated by school, by parents, the media you consume is designed to keep you in this childish bubble that I so desperately wanted to break out of. Coming across a Louis Theroux documentary felt like I was finally being shown the truly chaotic nature of society that adults were working hard to assure me made sense. When kids ask adults uncomfortable questions like, why are there homeless people? Or why do some people commit crimes? They'll usually get a nice, warm, gentle answer. Don't worry, darling. Everything is running as it should. It's just some people have found life harder than others, or maybe some people have made bad choices that have led them into unfortunate situations. This was incredibly unsatisfactory. Why, I wondered, would people make these bad decisions? If life is running as smoothly as adults continue to try and convince me it is, then how could anyone have found it so hard that they weren't able to find a house to sleep in? Now, I'm all grown up, struggling to keep pace with rent increases, and it's looking more and more likely that the planet will implode before I'm able to afford a house, so now I'm like, right, I see why you would keep that from me. And I thank you, well-meaning grown-ups, for not shattering those comfortable illusions that I had as a child, that I wish more than anything I could return to.
So sad. Innocence lost.
But before I could really grasp these material realities, it felt to me as though Louis Theroux was the only window I could find into the outside world that was willing to say, yes, your suspicions are correct. The world makes no fucking sense whatsoever. Look at all these freaks out here. Something's off. Especially in his younger days when he was more cavalier and looking for ways to cause trouble. He gave off a cheeky, childish energy that resonated with me as making sense that he would be the one to subvert the soothing explanations of grown-ups, as he had this youthful spirit that was not quite child, not quite adult, and he could see through the pretending. Recently, the BBC launched a rolling 24-hour Louis Theroux channel. They marketed him as opening your eyes to the hidden lives around you, very much in keeping with his reputation as someone who's going deeper than we're ordinarily willing to look, and bring you insight that's lacking from other sources. With the deepest regret though, I feel as though this understanding of him is yet another childish illusion, and contrary to the idea that he's bringing us the real truth, hidden truths we're missing, his documentaries are actually liberal media manifestations of the grown-up impulse to tell a comforting narrative to the child who's confused about some inconsistency in the world of everything's fine.
This is fine.
With his gonzo style of journalism, embedding himself in subcultures that express the full weirdness of the human behavioral spectrum, it's tempting to believe he really is opening our eyes. But what we're shown of these people's situations comes to us in the form of traditional liberal narratives. When you pay close attention, you come to realize his explanations for anomalies of a well-functioning society, like poverty, crime, racism, are soothing dismissals of these problems' existence. We're told modern liberal society is a positive and well-functioning system of governance. The problems we see around us do not result from the system, but from the problem of individuals within it. Most individuals are happy enough to get on in liberal society, but many either lack the moral capacity to live in a civilized society, or mistakenly blame liberal society for the roots of their oppression, and their resistance to the system should lead us to discount their grievances. In focusing on Louis, this isn't supposed to be a replication of this mythology of individualism. Louis is not the lone, single actor in the world propagating liberal ideology. This isn't about criticizing this one individual. In this video, think of Louis as one node in a huge amorphous network of information, of which he replicates the dominant liberal narratives that flow through this network. He's little more than one body or host among infinite hosts for ruling class liberal ideology, though I think he's worthy of highlighting in particular, given his reputation as someone who's able to bring us the real truth of what's going on. He's not supposed to be just another regurgitator of commonly accepted folktales. He's the real deal. He opens our eyes and wakes us up from our ignorant slumber. I'll be focusing on 5 documentaries he made for the BBC over a 2-decade period, all of them focusing on social issues like policing, crime, incarceration, and the racial animus toward the liberal society that contains these problems. Starting in 1999, when Louis ventured out to Harlem, New York to film an episode on black nationalism.
I was on my way to Harlem to spend time with New York's black power groups, and I'd arrived at a sensitive time.
4 New York City police officers shot and killed an unarmed African immigrant.
Despite the serious subject matter, he sticks to his usual formula for generating the terrifically awkward interactions we know and love him for.
Somehow, our relationship never developed beyond the formalities. In fact, it became even more awkward.
However, I think his black nationalism documentary also presents us with the limits of his approach. Black nationalism is an ideology that contends black Americans have the right to create their own society, separate from white America, where they can self-determine their own governance structures and escape the oppressive forces they're subjected to in racist US society. Louis' show at the time was called Weird Weekends, so implicitly there's the understanding that the people and subcultures he's meeting are in some way weird, but to put black nationalists in the same weirdness category as UFOologists and televangelists feels at best in poor taste. To be fair, when you're dealing with a group like the Nation of Islam, there has to be some weirdness involved. They are at the very least an eccentric bunch. But to be distracted by the bizarre aesthetic trappings of the black Israelites while you're ostensibly trying to learn about why black nationalism is resonating within communities like Harlem, where police killings and systemic racism are facts of daily existence, it's low-hanging fruit, and gives the impression you're not seriously there to understand the black nationalist perspective, but to undermine it. The central area of tension between Louis' liberal ideology and the black nationalists is concerning the distinction between peaceful and violent protest.
What if there were a peaceful solution? What if there were a way to
There is
protest
no
and
peaceful
march
solution.
and to stop
There is
police
no
brutality
peaceful
peacefully?
solution.
If there were, though, would you advocate that?
Louis meets Khalid Mohammed, an activist we are told has particularly militant tendencies, advocating violent resistance in response to police violence.
In 1998, he organised the Million Youth March and was accused of inciting violence against the police.
In self-defense, if they attack you, take their goddamn guns from them and use their guns.
While at the site of slain black man Amadou Diallo, Louis broaches the subject of violence as a means of political change with Mohammed. But when Mohammed tries to defend the merits of this strategy, Louis hits him with the old, but 2 wrongs don't make a right. Violence is always bad. Khalid's passion in response to this is genuinely moving.
I believe when caskets roll in the black community, that they must also roll in the white community. I believe that
Let me just jump in there, because I already see that's already
is the
to
key
me
here.
problematic. You're saying that basically the answer to the death of Amadou Diallo is more killing? It sounds like what you're basically advocating is race war.
I'm not the advocate of it. Those who shot and killed Brother Amadou Diallo are the advocates of it. Do you realize where we're standing? Do you realize where we are? We're standing where my brother was shot down in cold blood.
The audacity to say to someone at the site where an unarmed black man was killed by police, it's problematic for you to want to retaliate. It's so ignorant of the emotional tyranny being inflicted on the people living there, and such ivory tower liberal ideals. The very system, this Western liberalism that tells us things like violence is always wrong, change must only be achieved through peaceful means, is the exact same system that perpetuates explicit violence on racial minorities. It also ignores the reality liberal society was built on violence. Wiping out native populations, enforced slavery. America literally had to fight a war of independence. Was that wrong? The Civil War was, you know what I'm saying. This liberal tendency of, oh, we'd love to support you. Love to support you. But we can never condone violence.
Pillage, looting, murder, and arson have nothing to do with civil rights. They are criminal conduct.
This is by no means a new tendency. A 1969 essay from the socialist Pan-Africanist activist Stokely Carmichael describes exactly this tendency. In The Pitfalls of Liberalism, Carmichael writes, "The most perturbing question for the liberal is the question of violence. The way the oppressor tries to stop the oppressed from using violence as a means to attain liberation is to raise ethical or moral questions about violence." The US being at the time engaged in the Vietnam War, where the establishment was more than happy to deploy violence on a devastating scale, this led Carmichael to conclude, the oppressor never really puts an ethical or moral judgment on violence, except when the oppressed picks up guns against the oppressor. In the documentary The Black Power Mixtape, Angela Davis can also be seen explaining this perspective in 1972 to a liberal journalist confused on the Black Panthers' adoption of violent tactics.
Yeah, but the question is more, how do you get there? You get there by confrontation, violence?
Oh, is that the question you were asking?
Yeah.
Because of the way this society is organized, because of the violence that exists on the surface everywhere, you have to expect that there are going to be such explosions. You have to expect things like that as reactions. And when you live under a situation like that constantly, and then you ask me, whether I approve of violence. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense at all.
This is a concern that has existed for as long as black radicals have sought to redress racial injustice. You'd think maybe at some point we could consider the question of violent resistance to systemic violence asked and answered, but the question isn't actually about understanding why violence is seen as a legitimate tactic by these radicals. That's why it never goes away. It's about giving liberal society an excuse not to side with the oppressed, not to have to acknowledge the liberal society we believe in is propped up by violence against oppressed people inside and outside its borders. So long as the oppressed are advocating violence, we can continue oppressing them with our own systemic violence, because violence is wrong. After a frosty first encounter with black activist leader Al Sharpton, Louis develops a pretty good rapport with him and pays him another visit towards the end of the documentary. He confides in Sharpton that he feels a bit deflated having undertaken this journey and coming away feeling like there's no hope for convincing the radicals to reorient themselves to the style of non-violent protest that Sharpton himself does conform to. But what Al Sharpton says in response, I don't think Louis was expecting.
So you were telling me about your soldier and how has it been?
Well, it's been interesting. It's been, I would say, slightly depressing. One of the things I find encouraging about your work is that it is basically non-violent, and looking for an integrated future, whereas someone like Khalid Mohammed, he wants to establish a separate state.
Khalid Mohammed hasn't hurt anybody.
No, he hasn't. No, but I do fear that maybe his proposals for arming the masses could lead to people getting hurt.
But why are you fearing what could hurt and not fearing what has hurt? NYPD, New York City Police Department, has hurt people. I mean, I don't agree with everyone's strategy, but they're not the problem.
Louis seems to view the dividing line as between those who are non-violent and those who do not disavow violence, with extremists like Khalid Mohammed on one side and reasonable moderates like Al Sharpton on the other, with Louis and the other well-meaning liberals. But Sharpton says, no, the dividing line is not a question of tactics. It's a question of, are you in support of the system and its institutions of oppression like the NYPD, or are you against it? The police killing of Amadou Diallo is an underlying narrative going on in the background of the documentary as a point of reference for the ongoing racial tensions.
Outrage about Amadou Diallo was growing. 4 officers who shot at him 41 times were still on duty, and the mayor had done nothing to convince the black community that he was concerned.
Who was the mayor of New York in 1999?
Oh my goodness! Former mayor of New York City!
Is that Robert Duvall?
No, that's not Robert Duvall.
Rudy Giuliani!
Ah yes, Rudolph Giuliani. Rudy was credited with a tough-on-crime attitude that cleaned up the streets of New York.
I thought there was no crime in New York anymore. Giuliani!
The policies he instituted were based on a theory of criminology thought up by intellectuals on the payroll of think tanks funded by conservative billionaires. It was called broken windows theory. The idea was that indicators of delinquency and antisocial behavior, such as broken windows or graffiti, gave a cue to others in the neighborhood that criminal activity was acceptable. And this led to more serious criminal activity. Tagging is a gateway drug, apparently. This idea, constructed by minions of the ruling class, argued that increased police presence and increased powers granted to the police was necessary to stop the criminal activity. Police were ordered to target misdemeanor offences like jaywalking And the stop and frisk policy was brought in, allowing police to detain, question and search anyone seeming suspicious, which basically meant non-white.
Consequences is people say, oh my God, you are arresting kids for marijuana, they're all minorities. Yes, that's true. Why? Because we put all the cops in the minority neighborhoods. Yes, that's true. Why do we do it? Because that's where all the crime is. And the way you get the guns out of the kids' hands is to throw them against the wall and frisk them.
Broken windows policing increased the amount of police interactions in these communities, inflaming racial tensions further. More people ended up with bullshit convictions like personal possession of drugs or underage drinking.
If we have more police interacting with people, having them on the streets, we can prevent crimes. We can prevent petty crimes from turning into something worse.
On a federal level, Bill Clinton's 1994 crime bill, supported in the Senate by Joe Biden, laid a national framework for law and order tough-on-crime policy that targeted those demographics most caught in the cycles of poverty, ignoring the socioeconomic factors at the root of the issue, instead simply trying to curb the visible symptoms of systemic racism that made middle-class white society so uncomfortable. All of this political context that shapes the conditions for black nationalism to arise, showing hostility towards the police and the white system of governance that deployed them, is not factored in by Louis. The fact that Giuliani hadn't condemned the shooting of Diallo is focused on, albeit briefly. It isn't mentioned that perhaps the reason he hasn't condemned it is because of his own policies that push for heavy-handed policing in these communities, and could be called directly responsible for the death of Diallo. But for the liberal mindset, all that is needed from leadership in times like these is to come out and say, racism is wrong. Still, perhaps we could give Louis the benefit of the doubt here. This was his first real exposure to the world of state violence and domination against its own people. Perhaps as time goes on, his thinking might evolve, and he might come to view these people most oppressed under the forces of systemic violence as having genuine grievances with the system of white liberal capitalism that Louis sees as being generally a positive force in the world. So towards the end of the 2000s, Louis produced 3 documentaries on maximum security detention facilities in the US. One in 2008 at the San Quentin, California State Prison, and a 2-part special on Miami-Dade County Pretrial Detention Center, with part 2 including a boot camp program the jail runs to rehabilitate inmates. Again, in these settings, Louis is confronted with subjects who come from some of the most impoverished backgrounds in the developed world. People who have had a lifetime relationship with incarceration, often beginning in childhood. People who have been born into communities of low employment, underfunded public infrastructure, over-policing and the antisocial manifestations of these problems, domestic violence, gang activity, and substance abuse. If we were hoping for an angle that would reflect a change in Louis' outlook, that perhaps these people are products of their environment, and their environment is shaped by hostile systems of power that maintain the subjugation of people by race and class, then we are left sorely disappointed. For someone with such a reputation for bringing us fresh perspectives, these documentaries offer some of the most stale, warmed-over, stereotypical portrayals of incarcerated people as depraved savages whose behavior is not contingent on their conditions, but is the result of their own individual moral failings. Basically, these are bad people, and we good people in the audience can feel relief in the knowledge that society isn't failing them, they are failing society. This kind of anti-poor programming became pervasive on British TV towards the start of the 2010s, with a new conservative government implementing an agenda of austerity, gutting public services and demonising the poor, who were represented as opportunistically draining the public budget. Cultural critic Mark Fisher applied the term post-reality TV documentary to a slew of entertainment reality television dressed up as informative documentary during this period. Much reality TV posits an implied bourgeois gaze, which judges working class participants as lacking by comparison with the middle class. Moreover, this lack is understood in heavily moralized terms. It isn't to be explained by the working class's lack of resources or opportunities, but by a deficit in will and effort. This implied perspective, seldom actually stated, but informing the whole way in which programs are produced, is typical of the post-reality TV documentary. Post-reality TV documentary projects a radically depoliticized world of individuals. Louis Theroux's prison documentaries are absolutely a product of this bourgeois gaze post-reality TV documentary framework. There are 2 central themes woven into the fabric of these prison documentaries. The first is to completely disregard and avoid presenting perspectives that could offer socioeconomic or political explanations for criminal behavior, with only a handful of very mild gestures towards pondering the broader social conditions. The second theme is to portray these people as pure individuals, and as individuals capable of making decisions, the only relevant factor in the choices we've made is our moral character. Louis continuously asks the inmates the same condescending, morality-laced questions. Why did you do a bad thing? Do you feel bad you did a bad thing? Why won't you all stop doing bad things? If we don't think about social relations like race, class, poverty, capitalism, then we're all equal in the eyes of this bourgeois gaze of post-reality TV documentary. And so when we hear an inmate committed a crime, we think, well, I haven't done a bad thing that's led to my imprisonment, but this person has, and there's no difference between us, we're both just people, but he did a bad thing, and I didn't, so the only answer as to why they did a bad thing is they are lacking moral character. Again, society is not failing these people, they are failing society by being bad. There's just a constant fog of confusion hanging over the whole thing where we go round and around again trying to understand why these people have broken these codes of moral conduct, but with zero social analysis, the only conclusion we're left with and are directed towards is people who do bad things are bad. Simple as that. Not much we can do about it. For some context of the conditions that shaped Louis' ideology, here's Louis on his podcast discussing his upbringing with working class comedian Frankie Boyle, where they remark on the differences in the class dynamics they experienced growing up.
Well, the first time I got drunk, this is going to make me sound like a knob, never mind. I was with my parents on a skiing holiday. It was fondue night at the hotel. In France, where we were, there's a drinking culture and they bring wine, and kids drinking wine isn't a big deal. I woke up the next morning and I'd shat my pants. At the time I'd drunk enough to actually shit my pants.
It sounds like a level of drunkenness, doesn't it? Shit yourself at a fondue night drunk.
Yes.
It's hard to talk about these things from a subjective perspective, kind of comes across to people who've never been in that situation. The hopelessness of feeling that you're growing up, you're kind of going to struggle to find anything rewarding to do with your life. Your best hope really is to get into uni. That was the escape route, I guess, for the people that could get it. But maybe, I don't know, if you're having fondue and going skiing at 13, that's a very difficult mindset to get your head around, the idea that people would respond to life in general like that. But I feel that's how I responded to it.
It sounds like maybe you weren't even having that many fondue parties.
Louis is the son of Paul Theroux, a very accomplished travel author whose success from writing gave Louis a very comfortable upbringing in and out of ski chalets. For Louis and his friends growing up, there was never any concern or remote possibility that he might somehow join a street gang or consider armed robbery or car theft to be a logical way to earn an income. But that's how he presents to us the confusion as to why others did join street gangs and did steal or kill. Like, he seems to think all these inmates on the outside were living nice suburban lives where the opportunities for education or training for gainful employment were there for the taking. Louis opens part 1 of the Miami mega jail episode asking an inmate why a violent incident had recently occurred in the jail.
Can you speculate on what might have been a reason for it happening?
What might have been a reason? Because we're all criminals, vicious animals.
This self-reported characterization sets the tone for the documentary to present the narrative that human behavior is nothing more than individuals making decisions on an equal playing field. Those who make morally reprehensible decisions are simply vicious animals. This soundbite from an inmate grants a perception of legitimacy to this theory, as why would he say that about himself if it wasn't true? An answer to that could be provided by someone like Frantz Fanon, who explores the impact of colonialism and racism on the psyche of the colonized and the oppressed. Fanon concluded that colonized and oppressed people tend to think the worst about themselves. Trapped in social relations of economic deprivation, with little access to education and only hearing the narratives about themselves proliferated by the oppressors, they internalize their apparent unworthiness and view themselves as described by those who condemn them. But Louis takes this confession at face value. He has no reason to ask, what makes you say that about yourself and fellow inmates? Because this is exactly the angle the documentary is driving towards. Louis interviews the same inmate again later on while he's having a disciplinary hearing for beating up another inmate with a history of mental health disorders. He intros this section with a voiceover saying,
"The most common punishment for beating a fellow inmate is 30 days in solitary."
He doesn't question whether or not dehumanizing isolation as punishment could be a factor that exacerbates violent inmate behavior, even though studies have very much supported this idea. He just lets that statement hang there and moves on to another morality question.
You don't feel bad about doing that to a psych patient? That doesn't seem rather brutal and animalistic to you?
I love the inmate's subtle look of confusion when Louis says to him,
"You wouldn't do that on the outside."
I wouldn't do it on the outside?
You wouldn't behave in the same way on the outside.
Yeah.
Just that look of like, what do you think my life is like outside of here? I have a Latin Kings tattoo on my neck. I'm not an accountant with a picket fence and a ride-on lawnmower.
What you know, son? This is Paco, leader of the Latin Kings.
That's a weird name for a landscaping company.
But to Louis, when prisoners are on the outside, they're just regular middle-class people like him.
If your next-door neighbor was doing something that bothered you, wouldn't you have a reasonable conversation?
And when they get into a situation that could potentially lead to conflict, they'll do as he does and say to themselves, wait a minute. What would the Enlightenment philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau do? I must honor the social contract of civilized society.
When you're institutionalized, that makes you feel like that's the way I respond. If a person disrespects you, then you assault them, right?
No.
You don't?
You're asking me? No.
Like, oh, that's the way I was brought up. That's the way I thought it went.
It sounds like maybe you weren't even having that many fondue parties.
It's doubly frustrating because it's not like Louis is actually ignorant of the reality of conditions outside of prison that the vast majority of inmates come from. He literally got driven around Harlem in a bus with Al Sharpton, who pointed out to him the economic dynamics of the community.
New York is basically a city where blacks are in one area, some areas is blacks and Latinos, then whites in a total different community. The high idea of integration in America is a myth. There's no banks in Harlem. And when you look at the lack of development and the housing conditions, it's amazing. And we have to live in these conditions. But look at the conditions now. We've just gone 2 blocks out of Harlem. Look how clean the streets are. In 2 blocks, the city discovers how to take care of a community.
The city's resources are clearly not equitably distributed. Financial institutions like banks that can lend and provide credit didn't exist in Harlem. It was incredibly difficult to get funding to start a business in the community, meaning far fewer opportunities for employment and stable incomes were on offer. But during the course of these prison documentaries, Louis never acknowledges the reality of the conditions for these people on the outside, and when offered opportunities to, he redirects the concerns around individual morality. See if you can spot the moment he does this in a later exchange with another inmate.
What were you accused of?
Murder.
And you were convicted?
Yeah.
What did they give you?
40. Yeah, I stabbed the base. He didn't want to pay my money.
A crackhead?
Yeah.
How old are you?
21.
21. How do you feel?
To be honest, when I'm in here, I feel relief.
Why?
Out there's too much pain.
Why?
Got to take care of mom, who's an alcoholic. Sister went to prostitute all day. So I was growing up. So here I feel relief.
Were you high when you stabbed him?
No.
Louis literally just been told something, in the words of the Wu-Tang Clan.
Living in the world no different from a cell.
This guy's life outside of jail was so harrowing and depressing that the stability of incarceration was relief from the anxiety. Let's not get distracted with how dysfunctional a society has to be to create these conditions the inmate described. Let's instead imply his own actions led to this situation, because he didn't have the moral fiber to
just say no.
Of course, Louis doesn't do much better interrogating the conditions inside the jail either.
I was confused about how much of the behavior was created by the inmates and how much by the conditions that they lived in.
Part of Louis' shtick is being confused. It's a narrative device so that his confusion can be remedied by having the situation explained to him, and thus to us, the viewer. Except, he never actually addresses this confusion. I think this is the only time the word conditions is mentioned, but it's immediately followed up by a conversation with an inmate where, again, the shocking violence of prison life is foregrounded.
Do you approve of that whole code, that way of being from the outside? It looks like savagery, meaningless savagery.
When we use words like savage to describe people, do we typically mean the conditions they live in cause this savagery? Or these people have an innate savageness, an incivility that is the driver behind their meaningless violence? If you've taken a political compass test, you've responded to the statement, there are no savage and civilized peoples, there are only different cultures. The subtext of this statement is born of the debate between cultural relativism and colonial ethnocentric worldviews. In the heyday of Western colonialism, Westerners saw a duality between themselves and those outside their borders whom they colonized, with themselves obviously being civilized and those they colonized being primitive savages. This myth of civilized versus savage removed the necessity for civilized people to treat these savages according to the moral codes that were supposedly a hallmark of civilized society. If they were truly savage, there was no reason we couldn't occupy their land, appropriate their resources, exploit them for labor, and claim this was all a project of spreading civilization around the world. Louis here is conforming to this same colonial gaze that judges outsiders who violate the moral standards of Western liberal societies as being less than members of liberal societies. When he says, from the outside, what he in effect means is from inside our Western colonial culture, looking into another culture, and when he looks, what he sees is,
it looks like savagery, meaningless savagery.
The duality of the colonial gaze that views us as civilized and judges others in different circumstances by our own culture's moral standards is replicated here. And the consequence of this replication is that we view inmates in the carceral system as less than us, and frees us from having to wrestle with considerations of understanding them on their own terms, and from feelings of responsibility to treat them with the dignity we tell ourselves our societies treat us all with. Louis does at one point attempt to offer a solution to this problem of violent behavior in these facilities.
Since I've been here, one of the more shocking things is how much violence there is among the inmates. Just wonder whether there isn't more you could do to try and control that, and whether there isn't more that the county could do to control these inmates and to stamp out this predatory culture.
Well, we've tried being authoritarian and dehumanizing, but could we be more authoritarian and dehumanizing? That'll work. That's what we need. More state violence and coercion will surely fix this predatory culture. The words predatory culture here are clearly ascribing the dynamics of inmate behavior to their own human agency, absolving the harsh, competitive, totalitarian nature of the conditions that they are subjected to and have zero control over. Recall Louis' incredibly mild invocation of Rudy Giuliani's responsibility to condemn the killing of Amadou Diallo. Now, Louis proposes the core ideology of Giuliani's policies for tackling crime: the broken windows theory. The only way to prevent criminal activity is to stamp it out, and to subject the people in these circumstances to heavy-handed control. Do not alter the structural underlying conditions from which the antisocial behavior emanates. For all Louis' confusion about the competing narratives of innate inmate behavior and the conditions therein, Louis not once asks a question that could elicit an opinion on how enforced scarcity can produce hierarchies, given the need to compete. This is something that Anthony Bourdain discovered during a trip to Haiti. Bourdain speaks of a bourgeois upbringing much like Theroux, but when he went off making documentaries around the world, he didn't try to impose Western liberal standards of morality everywhere he went. In fact, quite the opposite. His experiences very much altered his perception of the West as he absorbed perspectives that highlighted the legacies of American imperialism.
He wants to know if you're afraid of seeing the reality.
Afraid? No, it hurts, but I think that's appropriate, you know. Americans, every American should see the results of war. I think it's the least I can do is to see the world with open eyes.
Bourdain visits a restaurant in Haiti, a country with a long history of colonial subjugation, first by the French, then by the US, which still has a significant influence on the country's economy and politics. The owner tells Bourdain business is not so good, there is so much poverty that no one can afford to buy from her. After the shoot, there's plenty of leftover food. Bourdain earnestly wants to help. He says, let's give this food to the people, but it wasn't quite that simple. When people are habituated to conditions of scarcity, hierarchies of dominance emerge to compete for the limited resources on offer. A very ugly scene ensued where the strong were throwing the weak out of line for the food. Experiences like this had an effect on Bourdain.
How do you spend time with people and you empathize with their plight? How does it not change you fundamentally?
Unlike Bourdain, Louis is unchanged by these experiences, meeting people in undesirable social conditions. He doesn't go in with an open mind to learn and understand. He goes in and imposes the narratives of liberal colonialism on them. Again though, this isn't about individuals. This isn't about Anthony Bourdain good, Louis Theroux bad. It's about how ruling class bourgeois ideology is promulgated so pervasively in our media and other institutions that we are constantly conditioned to view the world through this bourgeois colonial gaze that rationalizes the inequalities we see around us and obfuscates the dynamics of oppression that create them. Bourdain though was able to escape this gaze and invert it, centering the perspective of the other over our Western-centric viewpoint. He came to understand our differences were in culture and conditions, not civilized versus savage. Louis though clearly views America through very different eyes than Bourdain. If you haven't watched any Louis Theroux before watching this video, you may be thinking he's not worth watching, but funnily enough, most of his other stuff is really good TV. His episode Louis and the Nazis is in my opinion his best. Do you come away learning exactly why Nazism and racism are forces in modern day liberal capitalist societies? No, but that's fine. That's not the purpose of the show. The purpose, as Louis says, is
trying to find the humanity in people whose worldview is probably the most abhorrent and discredited conceivable.
We meet some Nazis in their everyday settings. We watch him have awkward interactions with them, and that's it. It's very entertaining, but you do also see these people beyond the heavily charged descriptor of Nazi. They become three-dimensional human beings. Not particularly appealing human beings, but we actually see them as they are. If the goal is to understand the humanity when it comes to Nazis, why is that not also the goal with incarcerated people? Why does the goal seem to be to invalidate their humanity? One of the characters Louis follows is Tom Metzger, a reasonably prominent figure in the American neo-Nazi scene. After witnessing Tom having a polite interaction with a non-white Peruvian man, Louis claims Tom is a hypocrite. Everything he stands for is a lie.
And you pal around with people who are non-white. You're living a happy life in a gorgeous multicultural community. Your day-to-day life is a standing refutation of everything you profess to believe.
No, it's not either.
It is. Well, I think you're a hypocrite.
Oh, okay.
As abhorrent as his views were, I found it hard to take Tom totally seriously. He seemed to like being seen as a dangerous figure, but was all the while enjoying the fruits of a multiracial democracy.
It's pretty jarring to hear the US described these days in such glowing terms as a multicultural democracy.
America is the least racist, multi-ethnic, multiracial country in history.
This was filmed in that sweet spot post 9/11 but pre-Iraq invasion, so global sympathy for the US was at an all-time high, but only a few years prior, Louis was in Harlem, where if he'd been listening, he would have heard his interview subjects giving him the perspective that America is very much not a functioning multicultural democracy. To be honest, and I hate to side with the Nazi, but he pretty clearly is a massive racist who enjoys being racist. And if he had the power to, I'm guessing he definitely would make some pretty troubling changes to US society. It feels as though Louis was kind of waiting for an interaction like this so he can present his explanation for why not everyone follows the ideology of liberalism as Louis does. You see, this Nazi isn't truly a Nazi, he actually loves this society. Who wouldn't? It's awesome. His Nazism is all just a LARP.
Heil Hitler?
Heil.
You're not supposed to do that, Daryl. You know you're not supposed to do that.
Louis speaks with April, a proud mama fascist, raising her 11-year-old girls to make white power music.
I don't like that. I don't like to be around them. I want to be around all white people.
I'm not being facetious, but have you ever thought about getting some kind of therapy or something? Because what you have is like almost like a pathological...
Have you ever thought about getting therapy and maybe realizing how brainwashed you are by multiculturalism?
I feel like I'm pretty well connected to reality.
Well, see, I feel that I am too.
Louis here is making a typical liberal mistake of thinking he sees the world according to objective reality rather than ideology.
Ideology!
When the Soviet Union collapsed, liberal theorist Francis Fukuyama wrote this was now the end of history. With the demise of the last competing economic system of communism, liberal capitalism is now the only structure of governance, and without alternative standpoints to interpret the world through, liberalism as the only remaining ideology is now reality. We can only see the world one way, the liberal way, and with no other possibility, that makes this the truth. Liberalism is the true order of things. But then, when we see the liberal go into situations that contradict the ideals that liberalism is supposedly based on, of all men are created equal or whatever, and instead of presenting the actual reasons for crime, we get representations of these people as animalistic savages, whose individual lack of morality is reason enough to not look deeper into their grievances. We should be able to recognize this liberal standpoint is not reality itself. It is in fact liberal ideology, not reality, that says crime is caused by bad people. The hyper-focus on individual behavior obscures our visibility of broader social forces and the behavior of institutional centers of power. In San Quentin State Prison, Louis meets an inmate he describes as
an inmate who stood out even among these hardened criminals for the brutality of his crimes.
We learn this guy committed a series of violent home invasions where he used torture tactics to try and get information from his victims.
Why were you doing torture tactics?
If you don't feel they're giving up the information you need, you got to torture someone to get the information you want out of them.
Of course, the nature of his crimes are vile and extremely confronting, but it's very easy to project our disgust for these actions onto this individual actor who we believe is not our equal. Let's not forget sites like Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib where it was US policy to administer torture. Earlier it was mentioned 30 days of solitary confinement is the usual punishment for beating an inmate. The UN standard though is that any length of solitary longer than 15 days qualifies as torture. And of course, exploitation of prison labor is rife. US prisoners produce over $2 billion worth of goods annually and provide the prisons with over $9 billion worth of labor for maintenance. And yet they still struggle to afford necessities like soap on their prison wages and are threatened with punishments like solitary confinement, i.e. torture, or loss of visitation rights if they refuse to work. This systemic extortion is not what we focus on. The topic of extortion amongst inmates though is one Louis focuses on and applies the appropriate level of middle-class condescension and infantilization when asking inmates why they would take advantage of someone.
In the files it talked about, you've been written up for taking someone else's commissary. What happened?
Extortion. I got caught for extortion.
Why did you feel it was okay to extort this guy?
I don't know. Needed the commissary. I was hungry. I had to do what I had to do. It's survival of the fittest when you're in jail.
To me as an outsider, that seems unfair. To take something that doesn't belong to you. You can't really justify it as survival of the fittest.
I don't know, I can't explain it. You never been to jail, so you don't know what's going on in jail. But
do you still suppose that it's acceptable to behave in that way?
No, it's not acceptable, but it's jail. We have no choice but to do this stuff.
It's like he's chastising a child for taking their sibling's toy.
If you do that again, I'm going to put you on the naughty step. Do you understand me? Right, then you be a good boy, please.
Would he say that to the prison wardens who extort their inmates for profit? Would he ever consider telling the heads of Western states and capitalist firms who extort the developing world as a matter of routine reality, that's not very nice. You can't take things that don't belong to you. You can't just take cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo, pay their children poverty wages to dig it out of the ground for you. That isn't very nice of you. Extortion and torture have been pillars of US foreign policy, capitalist imperialism, and the carceral state. If these individual inmates who have broken these moral codes of civilized society are so deplorable, why does Louis seem to believe the US is a successful project when it's behaved exactly the same way as these inmates?
I'm slightly naive about these things. I have a bad habit of trusting authority figures.
In the Miami jail, we meet a 14-year-old boy. Yep, 14.
They are not just gangs of kids anymore. They are often the kinds of kids that are called super predators. No conscience, no empathy. We can talk about why they ended up that way, but first we have to bring them to heel.
Louis is at least a little confronted by a child confined here. Not enough to question whether or not this is okay in general, but enough to suggest he should maybe be attending classes while he's in here.
Do you go out for classes?
No.
Do you know why?
Nope.
Does anyone know why Brenton is not going to school?
He's in confinement.
For his safety, because he's a juvenile?
Because he's a juvenile.
But could he not be somewhere where he was a juvenile and safe and going to school?
Well, they have to take that up with administration.
Just exactly what is it I'm charged with?
You'll have to take that up with the inspector.
Some faceless, shadowy entity hidden behind a million layers of bureaucratic red tape, if it can even be said to exist at all. And this isn't a sign that things are not functioning, this is exactly how they are intended to function, to be frustrating, opaque, and keep any solutions to problems as far out of reach as possible. In 2005, a few years before Louis arrived at the San Quentin prison, there was a court-ordered review into the prison's operation. There were found to be 10 inmates who had died due to inadequate healthcare delivery, and the warden had to be dismissed for threatening disciplinary action against a doctor who tried to raise the alarm over the poor healthcare standards. The prison was also found to be understaffed, and at one point in the documentary, an alarm goes off, which turns out to be a false alarm. But when Louis asks the guard why he seemed on edge, the guard replies there weren't enough staff on shift to deal with a serious situation if something was actually going down. Of course though, we never hear about these poor standards, low staffing levels, or the negligence over healthcare delivery slavery. It is assumed the prison functions as it should. Don't question the system of authority, stay focused on the decontextualized misdeeds of individuals. In part 2 of the Miami jail episodes, Louis visits a boot camp program ostensibly designed to rehabilitate inmates by instilling them with discipline. San Quentin prison, though, had ended their similarly run boot camp program a few years before, as it was found to not reduce recidivism, because of course it doesn't. You can't just discipline the crime away.
I'm going to put you on the naughty step.
Sending individuals back out into the same impoverished conditions where they initially committed crimes will lead to reoffending. This cannot be prevented without altering the conditions. The ideology of the boot camp, though, doesn't see things this way.
Most of you, before you set out to commit whatever crime, some of you did it on the spur of the moment, some of you it was a crime of passion, so to speak, right? You just reacted. But think about it, before that happened, you thought about it. Some of you even strategized when and how you were going to do this. So if you think about it, where the mind goes, the man follows. Say that with me. Where the mind goes, the man follows. The man follows. Think about that.
The only relevant factor in crime, according to this system, is the individual's moral choice in the immediate moment preceding their decision to act. Every moment of their lives leading up to this moment, or the experiences they've had in conditions of enforced scarcity, insecurity, witnessing others being violent, the giant ramifications of their social relations, being at the bottom of racial and/or class hierarchies, none of this is relevant.
It doesn't matter whether or not they're the victims of society. The end result is they're about to knock my mother on the head with a lead pipe, shoot my sister, beat up my wife, take on my sons. So I don't want to ask, what made them do this? They must be taken off the street.
This perspective of the boot camp and liberal establishment as articulated here is precisely the perspective Louis has chosen to represent in these documentaries. For all the posturing around a nature versus nurture debate, we're clearly primed to understand the answers to the question of criminal activity to be nature. Individuals choosing to break moral codes due to their own lack of ethics. So don't worry about the conditions, because people like that deserve them. Even at the point of being born into these conditions, having done no wrong, growing up and being shaped by them is not our concern. You chose to do a bad thing. A decade later, and Louis has a chance for redemption. He's back in Florida, this time to learn about the local rap culture. Maybe now, older and wiser, Louis will have some understanding for the way conditions create behavior, for the way police target and vilify young black men from poor backgrounds like the ones he'll be meeting here.
These are violent criminals involved in gang activity.
Given the contrast between middle-class Louis and the rap subculture, we obviously get some quintessentially British upper-class, working-class humour, with a well-to-do Oxford-educated British man trying to penetrate the cryptic slang of street rap lyrics.
Nice. We be on that fuck shit too. What does it mean?
We don't fuck shit.
The class divide is also on full display when Louis meets a rapper with a huge wad of cash.
That's a lot of money. 20s, 50s, hundreds. Do you really want to be walking around with that?
I don't be worrying about that.
Why don't you put it in a bank? Let it earn some interest.
But what if somebody scam me?
Someone would scam you. Well, you got to look at what the rates of interest are.
This can pass as funny enough at first glance. Responsible adult tells oblivious kid, maybe a bank would be a better place for their cash. You could earn interest. Until you remember you've seen Matt Walsh make the same joke.
Stop right there for just a moment, because, you know, riding on the window of a car is not generally advised, and doing it while holding a wad of cash is also, it seems like a disaster waiting to happen, frankly. I don't know why he's holding the cash. I don't know, are they going to the bank? Is he going to deposit it in his savings account? If so, you know, that's responsible, that's good, but my tip is this, just keep the cash on the inside of the vehicle until you get to the bank to make the transaction. So
this does fall into a trope of the middle class gaze. For people like Louis who've grown up in stable conditions and had access to financial education, and probably much more familiar and reciprocal relationship with the banking industry, it's easy to look at through very patronizing eyes. Recall though what Al Sharpton said about banks to Louis back in 1999.
There's no banks in Harlem. Young man comes out the movement, building his own business. If he was a young white businessman, they would have given business loans.
If they didn't get a loan, though, how come it's still going ahead?
Because he had empowerment ideas. He went to businessmen in his own community and they believed in him.
Banks and lenders are less prominent in black areas. With lower opportunities to interact with and understand the banking industry, many African Americans do not have the necessary education that shows them how to handle and grow their wealth. This is something Black Panther leader Fred Hampton understood. Way back in the 1960s, Hampton has shown plans for a community credit union to be able to lend credit to the people in his community who are unable to access it through traditional financial institutions. Hampton, though, immediately flags the lack of educational information.
What about this bank? Credit union? Credit union. What will money be given out to people for? Well, the people would decide that. You need some living room furniture, maybe? You need a car, maybe? See, I got it. The thing is, with me, you dig, I need to know some more about it. I wish you had some more literature about the education thing here. Because you can form this with no education. Let me give you an example. Papa Doc hated everything white. Man, you couldn't put this white paper in front of Papa Doc's face. But he moved all the white people out and he took over and be the president. He did, calling no education. And the people that have been educated, they just said that we don't hate the motherfucker white people, we hate the oppressor, whether he be white, black, brown, or yellow. So we got to understand here the educational program that you have to be able to figure out whether it will go on the right lines where the people will end up in a situation where they can be able to really control themselves. You understand what I'm saying? With no education, the people take this local foundation and start stealing money because they won't be really educated to why it's the people saying anyway. You understand me? You might get them caught up in because they're poor and they want something. And then if they're not educated, they want more, and before you know it, they'll be capitalists, and before you know it, we'll have Negro imperialism.
Hampton's desire to educate and improve the conditions for his people made him a target for the white establishment. He was drugged by an FBI informant and murdered in his sleep by the Chicago Police Department. The financial system has long been hostile to the interests of impoverished African American communities, and attempts to build up the conditions of these communities and educate the people on finances has been met with violent retaliation from the white establishment. The comment the rapper makes,
"But what if somebody scam me?"
feels telling. The suspicion for trusting a financial system that has historically been hostile to your interests would be hard to overcome. Things get worse as Louis interviews a rapper named Glock 9.
He was the rapper allegedly most closely linked to the gang politics of his city.
Louis' framing for the prison documentaries of Conditions vs. Human Nature, or his framing on the Black Nationalist documentary of Violence vs. Non-Violent Resistance, in both cases being a false dichotomy where he claims these are the dividing lines of the debate, then only seeks to reinforce his one-sided liberal interpretation of these dichotomies. This is again replicated in this rap documentary. His framing here is, are rappers glorifying the violence of a gangster lifestyle, or are they unfairly characterized this way by the police? Of course, Louis has an answer in mind.
Do you have more to worry about in terms of the authorities or in terms of the street?
The police got my full attention right now.
You're not worried about street stuff?
I don't worry about the street stuff at all.
But that's how most rappers are dying when they die. Like those rappers who get shot, 9 times out of 10 it's from street business, right?
This line comes uncomfortably close to standard conservative talking points about black-on-black crime being the real issue in order to defend police killings of African Americans.
The fact is, I find it very disappointing that you're not discussing the fact that 93% of blacks in America are killed by other blacks.
Let me respond to that.
On the black side, you've got to teach your children to be respectful to the police, and you've got to teach your children that the real danger to them is not the police. The real danger to them, 99 out of 100 times, 9,900 out of 1,000 times, are other black kids who are going to kill them. That's the way they're going to die.
The real threat to young black men doesn't lie with white police officers at all. The real threat to young black men lies with other young black men. Murder is now the #1 cause of death for black males 15 to 34, and virtually all of those murders are committed by other young black men.
He asked an interview subject, do you feel more threatened by the police or others from the streets? He gets the response, it's definitely the police. And to his face he says to this guy, but the police rarely kill rappers. You're 90% more likely to be killed by someone else. Someone that maybe looks more like you. Another episode Louis released as part of the same series looked at how the Me Too movement had changed the porn industry. That's an interesting topic, understanding how events in recent history have altered a relevant industry. Prior to Louis returning to the game of minimizing the voices of the marginalized and presenting them according to stereotypes of middle-class society, was there some event that occurred recently he could have learned from and applied lessons from when trying to understand the plight of people in these communities? Nothing springs to mind. Louis ends with a monologue that pays lip service to the conditions these rappers come from.
Its closeness to the conditions it chronicles carries its own risk. But in leaving Florida, I was mainly struck by its power to reflect real life, laying bare the disenfranchisement of a generation with eloquent rage.
It's all well and good saying this, but the content of the documentary has done nothing to tell us about what has caused this disenfranchisement. And only a few moments ago, he suggested Glock 9 should be more afraid of street crime from other disenfranchised people in these conditions than the police. Then we fade into a text-only wrap-up that lends credibility to the claims of the police that these guys are violent criminals. It's clear we are meant to take the word of authorities on how to perceive young black men in society. Louis has been exposed to these dynamics of racist policing and systemically enforced poverty time and time again over decades, and he comes away with the same old story that has been around since the colonial era. Behaviors such as violence and crime are attributable to an innate savagery. The conditions people reside in are irrelevant. Individual morality is the only game in town. Liberal society tries its best to integrate everyone. The police and the prison system are doing their best to manage these individuals who choose to do immoral actions. Do not change the system, only try to hide the symptoms of its failure. Again though, this isn't about Louis specifically. Focusing on individuals is the job of liberalism. The real goal is to attack systems of power and control. As Stokely Carmichael made clear way back in 1969, the year Fred Hampton was assassinated by police, this is the disposition of the liberal mindset, to undermine the claims of the marginalized who point the finger at the establishment as their oppressor. 30 years later, and Louis Theroux was in Harlem, expressing exactly this tendency, chastising violent sentiments while ignoring the daily violence imposed by a system indifferent to their suffering. Another few decades pass by, and his continued exposure to these dynamics yields no change in his perception. The pitfalls of liberalism are immortal. They are expressed in every facet of our establishment, from the media to education into the minds of the general population. They will continue to be replicated because these ideas clearly outlive the individuals who hold them. Louis is but one node in this flow of liberal ideology. However, his particular stylistic effects, likable personality, and middle-class relatability has seen him garner the reputation of a journalist with a talent for bringing us stories that go deeper than we're used to seeing, and opening our eyes to the hidden lives around us. While I really do enjoy a lot of his programming,
I'm fantastic, I'm fantastic,
I don't believe what we're shown is actually some hidden perspective we're being woken up to. We are constantly subjected to media spectacle, and Louis Theroux as a mainstream media presenter is part of this spectacle and behaves according to its ideology.
I mean, I'm the media, I'm not sort of like disguising.
He is a continuation of this ideology, bringing us the same narratives we would fully expect from a system that wants to manufacture our consent. In Society of the Spectacle, Guy Debord writes, "The spectacle is the nightmare of imprisoned modern society, which ultimately expresses nothing more than its desire to sleep. Media can be used to create a pacifying, comforting view of reality that reinforces our desires to not have to think, not have to unravel and demystify the social relations we exist within, and understand who amongst us is oppressed or benefiting from oppression." Louis Theroux's distillation of liberal ideology is the blue pill we want, a blue pill painted red, so that we believe, oh, we're actually seeing the world as it really is. We're told we're being woken up to reality, but as it turns out, this reality is exactly what we suspected. The cracks and problems are not our fault. They're the fault of ungrateful, deluded, immoral individuals who refuse to yield to reality, the reality that we all agree is objective. And with this comforting lullaby, we slip easily into a blissful sleep, where we do not need to tire ourselves with any more questions or challenges to the way we understand the world to be. We are no longer ideological beings. We are in tune with the objective nature of reality at the end of history.
The kinds of kids that are called super predators. No conscience, no empathy. We can talk about why they ended up that way, but first we have to bring them to heel.
Doesn't matter whether or not they're the victims of society.
Ideology.
Just say no.
And virtually all of those murders are committed by other young black men.